Vampires have become a staple of books, film, and television over the last 100+ years, and even more so in the last few decades. Why is that? Well, it has been said that there are elements of truth in all great fiction, so if stories of vampires have endured throughout our storytelling, then maybe there is something more here than just our imagination. And that is precisely what we are here to explore today. From cults to historical figures and mysterious diseases, here are 5 real-life factual cases that may just prove that everyone's favorite monster is much more real than you might have previously suspected. The Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory is one of the most gruesome female serial killers in history. Born in 16th century Hungary, Elizabeth was by birth a noblewoman and would by all accounts be considered of high social standing. As her life progressed, however, she grew deranged and sadistic and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of women and may be the source of the disturbing image of a person bathing in blood. Elizabeth was a sickly child, rumored to be a result of inbreeding. As a child, she suffered from epileptic seizures and was at times given the blood of non-sufferers in an attempt to cure her of this ailment. Instead, it seemed to give Elizabeth a fascination with extracting and consuming the blood of others. Couple this with a complex betrothal and pregnancy at a young age, and Elizabeth's mental state can easily come into question. With her husband deployed on military service, Elizabeth took up the cause of caring for local girls, helping victims and teaching proper etiquette. However, soon these girls were found dead or missing, and suspicion lay at the feet of Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth's mania had descended to a point where she believed that consuming the blood of young women would preserve her youth and beauty. She was witnessed biting the flesh of these women and draining and bathing in their blood. With vampire panic spreading across Europe in the 16th century, it begs the question, was the Blood Countess the last of a real breed of vampires, or was she given a taste at birth? We could not discuss the potential historical existence of vampires without mention of the most iconic and influential figure in the work of the dark and supernatural. Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula. Born into a war of territory and an empire intent on expanding, it was ingrained in Vlad from a very young age that ruthlessness was necessary. In the early 1450s, Vlad was on the run due to ongoing conflict and found his way to Transylvania in order to rebuild his status as a warrior and leader of Wallachia. Upon reclaiming his throne, Vlad began a streak of unparalleled mayhem, which quickly gained him his infamous nickname. The time period makes it difficult to gain a complete picture of Vlad's methods, but he is known to have a fascination with blood and all things gruesome. His presence coincides with the height of vampire panic in Central Europe. His method of impaling with a stake is known as the way to kill a vampire, and his surname has inspired the most famous monster in fiction. You could not be blamed for thinking this is one too many coincidences. We turn now to talk about another more modern case, the story of Rod Farrell. As we question, what really makes a vampire? Common among many depictions of vampires is a hypnotic, cult-like persona, an ability to command a devoted following. Rod Farrell had this, convincing an accomplice to carry out gruesome acts in the name of the Vampire Clan, a group of Kentucky teenagers committed to their lifestyle as modern-day bloodsuckers. In 1996, Rod and other members of the Vampire Clan plotted to take the lives of the parents of member Heather Wendorf. The act was completed with the ritual of burning a V for vampire on the chest of Heather's father. If there is one thing that we know about vampires, fire, rituals, and symbols are always nearby. The Vampire Clan would conduct blood rituals and even feed off each other. This was certainly a lifestyle rather than a condition or proof of vampires in a supernatural sense. However, This is a rare and undeniable example of self-identifying vampires acting in bloodlust and without morality. Rod Farrell was ultimately convicted of his crimes and is currently serving a life sentence without parole. However, he remains one of the most notorious criminals alive today and has inspired many stories and rumors ever since. Many would go on to claim that Rod and the Vampire Clan were avenging the difficult home life that Heather suffered, and that they embody the vampire anti-hero. Others would call them criminals and insane. Ultimately, these may or may not be the closest monsters that we have to the vampires we picture. We have picked the Atlanta Vampire Alliance, or AVA, because of an interview that a member gave to The Guardian back in 2015. We'll get to that. But truthfully, we could have picked any number of real-life vampire alliances, communities, and councils around the world. According to the AVA in 2016, there were over 5,000 people in the USA alone who identify as vampires. In an interview with The Guardian newspaper, AVA member Murdicus openly discusses the practices and culture that goes along with being a 21st century vampire. Murdicus even goes as far as to distance himself and his alliance cohorts from what he calls poser and lifestyle vampires. While they do not claim to be undead, allergic to sunlight, or immortal, the dark reality of the AVA is that members do indeed consume human blood. The blood in this instance is given by willing donors and doesn't involve biting, but is still happening. Due to legal and health issues surrounding this practice, members of vampire groups like the AVA do, ironically, find themselves living life in the shadows. Is this life imitating art? Are groups like the AVA no different from the posers they criticize? Is their desire to consume human blood a real medical condition or mental illness? The jury may still be out, but what is undeniable is that there are practicing, self-identifying vampires alive and not biting somewhere closer than you might think. The Mercy Brown incident is one of the most renowned tales of real horror in the vampire myth in history. Bringing together everything we've discussed so far: historical figures, panic, persecution, disease, and the cult of belief, Mercy Brown is the most infamous case of were they or were they not in the discussion of the existence of vampires. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, a new bout of superstition and paranoia would grip rural New England. Only this time, fears weren't surrounding one's friends and neighbors, but family members feared to be undead. As with many cases of widespread suspicion, this belief that the deceased had cursed their living relatives had its basis in a misunderstood but very real affliction. In the mid to late 19th century, tuberculosis was running rampant, but much about the disease was unknown. Everything from fresh air to hypnosis was prescribed to patients, but roughly 80% of those with the illness would meet their end regardless of treatment. One such family affected by the epidemic was the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island. In 1884, the patriarch of the family, George Brown, lost his wife, Mary Eliza, to the disease. 2 years later, he would suffer the loss of his oldest daughter, Mary Olive, to the same fate. Then, in 1892, the farmer would experience another tragedy with the passing of his younger daughter, Mercy. When his son Edwin fell ill 9 months later, it prompted panicked neighbors to urge George to exhume the bodies of his wife and daughters for signs that one may be draining the life of Edwin Brown. Reluctantly, George gave in, and the findings would shock the small New England community to this day. Both Mary Eliza and Mary Olive's bodies showed the expected level of decay, but Mercy, who had been deceased for 2 months, showed almost no sign of decay and still had blood in her heart and liver. This was all the evidence fearful townsfolk needed to prove Mercy was draining the life force of her living relatives from the grave. In a desperate effort to save his son, George allowed the unthinkable. Mercy's organs were fed to her sick brother in the hope of curing his illness, a common belief at the time. But alas, Edwin suffered the same fate 2 months later. Could Mercy Brown have actually been feeding on her family? Was this just a very isolated case of disease? So there you have it. Myths or monsters, fact or fiction, in your mind or in the shadows. We don't know about you, but we think if we could prove it one way or the other, that would take away a whole lot of the fun. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. Comment below with your thoughts on the stories you have heard. And remember, there are elements of truth in all great fiction.